Ian Goodwin, as you can see from the slide, doctoral student at University of Wolverhampton. I retired from headship 4 years ago, and I decided that it would be a really good idea to become better acquainted with Linda to keep me out of trouble and to ensure I had an opportunity to engage with some research which I'd been particularly sort of interested to actually do. During my career, I, I worked in about 7 or 8 different sort of schools spanning 37 years, going from sort of a secondary start as head of music to working as head teacher in 4 different sort of schools. And I'm just reminded today of one encounter that I had with with one particular pupil when I was actually teaching in Wolverhampton. In fact, it wasn't really an encounter I had; it was an encounter that my head teacher actually had. It was another very hot day, and we were doing a PE lesson, and I'd taken the children outside. I'm not a PE expert, as you might have gathered. And the head teacher came out and he sort of said to me in his very dry sort of way, very supportive, but he had a particular way of saying things. You haven't changed for PE, Mr. Goodwin. And it was a very hot day. And one of the children sort of said, actually, he doesn't normally change for PE, Mr. who the head teacher was. And then he said, but give him a break, mister. At least he's taken his tie off. And you might be very pleased to know on a very hot day from Staffordshire, East Staffordshire, I have actually not got my tie on. So thank you very much for the opportunity to actually sort of present at this sort of conference. Very grateful to Lizana for the invitation, and also very grateful for the opportunities that Wolverhampton University do actually present to their students to actually engage in this sort of thing. I think we've had a fascinating 3 days thinking about collaborative professionalism, and I think there have been many insights which have actually sort of come out, particularly why it's important to actually have collaborative professionalism in all sorts of different areas of practice and education and all sorts of things like that. And I think my contribution tonight is not so much why it's important, but I'm hoping that what I say will have a little bit of relevance in terms of how we can actually create the understanding between partners and how that will actually support the effectiveness of those partners and partnerships that are created. I'm going to do this by sort of talking through the research I've been working on for the last few years. And in particular, my research relates to the reasoning of curricular decisions, which are connected with cultural diversity. I've called the talk Why? And I suppose I should say why, really. It's going to be a talk which focuses on the reasons for curricular decisions. And in particular, it's going to hopefully provide a little bit of an insight into why understanding the reasons for decisions that we take in schools, particularly to do with the curriculum, are really important and how they actually inform understanding. I suppose underlying this is my assumption that it's not only what's done in school that's important in terms of our understanding, it's also understanding why it's been done. It's understanding the motivation. And decision making, as I'm sure we are all aware, working in schools and educational establishments is something that is happening all of the time, from the point, of engagement within classrooms to engagement at playtimes and break times to strategic decision making and all sorts of things like that. So reasons for decisions can operate in all sorts of different ways, but the one thing I'm fully committed to is that understanding why really does inform that understanding overall. So the first why I suppose, relates to um, why the reasons are important to help us understand the conception of the decisions. And of course, I suppose it's there because it gives us some background, it helps us understand context, but ultimately, the why in relation to conception helps us to understand the purpose and the priority that is there in the decision making. The second why is very much to do with the implementation of the decision. And in particular, bear with me, I think my screen, there we go. In particular, how we align the decision to the circumstances that it is actually operating within. And my third why is why reasons are important as a means to better understand the nature of the outcome. So, in other words, moving on from just seeing the outcome as a particular sort of performance level and so on. So, I'd like to just at the start here, before I get onto the substantive part of my presentation, just to do a little bit of a task with you. And it's hopefully going to underline what I think is a really important key theme, which is going to be running through my talk. And it kind of aligns a little bit with what Andy was saying about the sort of the bottom-up approach, very much so. So I'm going to just think it through for yourselves, talk to the cat, talk to yourself, have an intelligent conversation, but just have a look at these following pairs of statements. And actually, between each of the pairs, on each of the lines, think, would you put equals or not equals between the statements? Okay, so there we go. We have got 101 and 101. We've got bark and bark. We've got 1.6 and we've got 2. Now, if you were looking at that, I wonder, would you put an equals or a not equals between them? I'll give you a few seconds to actually think about it, and then I'll talk through what I think you might have decided. What do you notice? I suppose the answer, really and truthfully, is that you can put either equals or not equals between all of them. 101 equals 101. It might be 2 England cricketers have both scored 101 on the first day of the third test match, or probably not. Alternately, 101 might not equal 101 if one of the numbers was binary. Bark equals bark, okay. Equals because it could be the same person. As Linda will know, J.S. Bark and Lizana, in fact, is one of my major heroes as an organist. And so it could be equals, but equally, or in the similar way, it could be not equals as well, because it could be bark equals doesn't equal back. In some contexts, back could be construed to be meaning something different. In the Welsh language, for instance, it's a term of endearment. And then getting back to the cricket theme, 1.6, well, you might say at that point, it doesn't equal 2 if it's just usual numbers. However, 1.6 in cricketing parlance means that 1 over and 6 balls of the next over have been bowled. And before it flips to 2, it comes up as 1.6 on one scoring sort of system for cricket. So although 1.6 looks as though it doesn't equal 2, in certain cricketing contexts, 1.6 could equal 2. So what's the point? What am I getting at? Well, I think the crucial thing in all of that is it's about understanding the context of the numbers, of the words, in order to actually fully understand what they actually mean and what they signify. It's a little bit like we sometimes have eats, shoots, and leaves. It could be eats, shoots, and leaves, or it could be eats, shoots, and leaves. The context is very important and it does affect the understanding and it does affect the understanding of the meaning. So context can be a crucial factor in understanding how and why the reasons for decisions are actually being formed. And that word context is a very important thread in the presentation moving forward. Those of you who are, well, maybe a little bit like me, who are very fond of dear old Rumpole of the Bailey, he often talked about the golden thread which runs through English justice. I'm talking very much about context as a key thread running through this presentation. So, moving on to my research in particular, as hopefully exemplifying a way that understanding and collaborative partnerships and professionalism can be established. So my research, I'm not going to bother reading that out. The current state of my title is as it is there, but crucially the aim is to develop a critical understanding of the nature, function and definition of the reasoning which underpins curricular decisions about cultural diversity in a selection of primary schools and its contribution to inter-school variability. So a little bit of the background to my actual research. The research was informed by, I suppose, my interest in understanding why, having done various sort of coaching and mentoring roles within schools, but also sort of from various sort of pastoral roles with children as well. I've always been fascinated to find out why. It has always informed my understanding of the situation. And I think that is something that very much lies at the background to my particular research. Understanding why, particularly in relation to curricular decisions. It's a way of really informing knowledge about what's been done. And the interest in cultural diversity has been sort of quite long-standing as well. Came about as a school that I was working at, where monies was prepared and given to people who to schools who were prepared to develop sort of cultural diversity further. That was going back into the 1980s. Part of my commitment, I suppose, to presenting a more equal view of the world in which we actually live. And it's also particularly poignant at the moment, I suppose, and in the last few years, given the emphasis Ofsted have actually sort of placed on schools personalising their curriculum. So I was interested to actually sort of see, you know, to what extent cultural diversity was incorporated into various schools' curricula, and more particularly the reasons why its position was sort of rationalised in the way that it was, the reasons. So before I start, I think it's important to sort of get a few assumptions out of the way right at the beginning, because I think it was important for me to actually stay at this particular point, but also to recognise in my research what I assumed about the reasoning which would underpin those curricular decisions. I thought, you know, from the start, I remember having this conversation with Linda, and we focused on sort of different things, that it will be a process that will be characterised by similarities and differences between schools. In particular, I was very much sort of exercised by the fact that some of those similarities would come from the common structures that sort of impinge on the decision-making process in all schools. We had national curriculum frameworks, we had systems which all schools were sort of part of. So I actually was very much sort of taken with this idea of reasoning being structurally informed but contextually defined. Okay, so my definition of the reasoning was structurally informed but contextually defined. And the contextually defined bit was really, really important. I'm sort of very keen on some of the writings of Priestley, who has commented on the importance of context in making sort of structures for education relevant in individual circumstances that schools encounter. So that was something that was really important to me. And in particular, I mean, Priestley comments on the fact that it's the contextual definition that makes those structures relevant in particular sort of situations, something that I'm sure we can all equate with. And that led me to very much sort of assume a paradigm for the research which is based on critical realism. So in terms of the literature review, I basically focused on sort of structural and contextual elements in curricular decisions about cultural diversity that were represented in the literature. In particular, sort of focusing on sort of different sort of interpretations and perceptions that sort of could exist in relation to those sort of particular structures. And I thought in particular about sort of philosophical responses to cultural diversity, political responses, as well as sort of the national educational frameworks as three particular structures. And I was sort of very much sort of the view that it isn't only the structures that sometimes sort of influence what we do in school, it's sometimes the different perceptions and perspectives that people actually have on those structures. And that's seen, for instance, in sort of the dichotomy that exists between different sort of philosophical definitions connected with cultural diversity. Ubroy and Madood sort of talk a little bit about sort of liberal school of multiculturalism, very much focusing fundamentally on those liberal values that underpin society first and foremost, and then the opposite being the Bristol school of multiculturalism, very much thinking about multiculturalism from the point of multiculturalism itself, and thinking how that can how that needs to be reflected and taken account of in terms of that liberal democracy that we live within. But also sort of things like the political response gives an idea of some of the support that's available for cultural diversity. I think sort of within politics, it's easy to see how that sometimes to polarize the views in terms of sort of support or opposition to sort of cultural diversity. But as very important as well, and I think this is important because it can sort of link in with what happens within school, is what I'm calling an expedient approach, where sort of fundamentally there's a support for cultural diversity at a political level, but actually sort of various policies come along, public opinion and this, that and the other, and somehow things get watered down a little bit in terms of how the response actually takes place, something that Husband sort of talks a little bit about in his book. And of course, different responses to the national curriculum. Within my literature review, I sort of came up with this idea of a two-pronged understanding of context. So context as a setting. So how does the context as a setting sort of take those structural influences that exist and turn them into a position that's appropriate for the school, and also context as a source. So in other words, those particular features that are peculiar to that particular context and how they actually impact on what is actually being done. And context is particularly important from the literature review because, as Linda said in the introduction, there's so much variety in the response to cultural diversity. We don't have an unequivocal sort of completely clear-cut steer on how we should be responding to cultural diversity in schools. It's very much down to the schools themselves, as it pretty much has been throughout the history of multiculturalism and its influence in schools. It's very much down to schools to decide what they are going to do. So two sort of particular ways that context can sort of impact in terms of the reasoning of sort of decisions. Firstly, providing the setting whereby positions formed for cultural diversity, but then also providing a source where particular sort of features. And what became clear as well in all of this is something again that sort of came out earlier as well is the complexity of the process. The literature reveals a very sort of complex sort of approach. Um, we have sort of people like Anderson and Jemnik sort of talking about the interplay of reasons and different types of factors which impact upon the reasoning. Schools make decisions, but it's also there as well in sort of Lipsky's sort of descriptions of the ways that public sector workers in the United States had to sort of think about all sorts of different things as they sought to implement sort of public policy. So it's not a straightforward process. It's a complex process in that lots of different things can actually impinge upon it. And from my literature review, I came up with the notions of looking at reasoning for curricular decisions from different dimensions. The literature review sort of helped me sort of pin that down to the constitution of the reasoning, thinking about those structural and contextual components, but also very much so looking at the importance that's attached to those individual components. So giving an indication of priority within the reasoning of the position that's being formed. And then sort of thinking about how the reasoning is orientated when it comes to the implementation of the position that's been formed. And also the fourth sort of dimension, thinking a little bit about how this affects comparability between the schools. So literature review, sort of very much sort of informing understanding, putting my research in a particular context, but also informing particular ideas for the investigation in terms of that multidimensional approach to understanding the reasoning, which informs curricular decisions. In terms of methodology, I've already sort of said, I'll only skirt over this. The paradigm is critical realism, but it's fundamentally because of the agenda I came up with. I decided it was going to be a case study. It wasn't going to be an expansive sort of survey of reasons for curricular decisions across loads and loads of schools. I wasn't seeking to make a generalized statement. I was seeking to understand and develop understanding of those different perspectives, different approaches that could apply to it. And so it was based on with discussions with school leaders in 8 different sort of primary settings. And those settings were sort of chosen partially from my own personal knowledge, but also with the idea of creating and making sure that different particular contextual features were reflected in the discussion, just as a way of maybe sort of seeing how different things might impact on that reasoning. I mean, I very much adopted quite a creative approach to the discussions. They were based on tasks, and the discussions allowed for quite a lot of triangulation within each discussion, allowing me to sort of see how particular aspects of the reasoning were developed, and as we moved through the discussion and thought about the 4 points that we were going to discuss. And it was also multi-sensory as well. It was based on sort of tasks, so it wasn't just a straightforward discussion. Different tasks, finding pictures to represent, coming up with a sorting exercise and things like that, but using that as the introduction to the actual discussion and taking it on from there. Analysis for me was very important. Analysis was something that was critically conceived, thematically framed, and sort of comparatively formed, and it was underpinned by coding. I'll just sort of mention here that it was a phased analysis, which Braun and Clark sort of refer to, but my version is slightly different to theirs. They very much concentrate on the process of analysis, of the stages of analysis, whereas my phased analysis is very much to do with different investigative focuses that are developed in relation to the reasoning, focusing on the constitution and prioritization within the reasoning, very much in the conception of the decisions, looking at how it's orientated in relation to the implementation, and also how it impacts on sort of the variability. So very, very important. And of course, it was both inductive and deductive. Deductive in the sense that I had some sort of clear themes based on the dimensions of reasoning which I wanted to investigate through analysis, but also inductive in that I was looking at sort of themes and particular categories and patterns which might be formed, which help to explain and give meaning to what was being done. So some findings, and fundamentally, what I found was, I suppose, underlining the significance of context. It provided a particular exemplification of the significance of context, both as a setting and as a source. And if we think a little bit about some of the findings in relation to the dimensions, various things sort of came out. All of my participants, for instance, relied on both structural and contextual components within their reasoning. And in particular, most of them sort of did refer to sort of cultural diversity. They all referred to the national curriculum. They all referred to the context in certain ways, albeit different ways. One of the things that sort of became very interesting for me was actually to do with looking at the transcripts of the discussions and thinking a little bit about how important the individual components were in relation to the reasoning overall. Where was the emphasis being placed on those particular components? Because some of the elements in reasoning seemed as though in the discussions to be given more prominence by certain people and less by others. One of my participants particularly focused on the importance of the national curriculum, and that was something that was felt to be very much the business of education, and that was very much at the heart, whereas others were sort of thinking a little bit more about the sort of the context and how that related to sort of to cultural sort of diversity. Within that emphasis, what was also quite interesting is that although different things could be emphasized, certain restrictive factors became apparent in the reasoning. I call those regulators. For some of the schools, there were certain conditions which seemed to regulate the approach or had to be taken into consideration when the approach to the reasoning of decisions was being carried out. For one person, well, for three of the schools in particular, it was very much a regulating factor based on the religious foundation of the school, of the schools, I should say. But quite interestingly, following on from what Andy was saying earlier, one person whose school was preparing to go into join the multi-academy trust actually very much was felt that that was a regulating factor in terms of what she could or couldn't do in terms of school improvement and also curricular development. There was a feeling that it had to align with what was being focused on within the MAT as an important sort of factor. In opposition to that sort of view, I suppose, is the view that from virtually all of the other participants, one other school hadn't yet joined a MAT, but of the six who had, they all tended to feel that actually they weren't restricted by their MAT. But it was just interesting for that to sort of raise its sort of particular head in certain context. So the MAT is a regulating factor for one particular person, although not for others, and also the religious foundation is a regulating factor. Within those sort of components that were used to sort of reason the conception of position, the decisions about how the position was going to be conceived, what also became clear was that there were some absolute and relative views of certain of those components. For some people, I've mentioned one person already, the national curriculum, for instance, was very much an absolute. It was about the national curriculum, and it was about making sure that that was implemented as effectively as possible. And that came over very much in what has been referred to as a sort of a managerial sort of position, people like Bottery and so on. Whereas others had a more relative view. They were prepared to use the national curriculum far more flexibly in order to actually construct their curricula and also ensure that sort of cultural diversity had a particular role within it. The Something else that sort of came out in terms of each sort of context was how the orientation of the reasoning sort of came over when it came to the implementation of position. It seemed as though the position that people actually took in relation to cultural diversity, some people took what I call a transforming position to cultural diversity. It was part of that transforming of the curriculum agenda, and it had a major sort of role within that. Some folks had what I called an informing sort of position, and that was very much to do with sort of cultural diversity in combination with other things informing the approach, but maybe not going as far in terms of that. And there was some people where it was very, well, one person in particular where it was very much about conforming to the national curriculum. So those positions very much sort of seemed to provide a particular lens on how contextual needs are perceived. The position provides the platform for considering what those contextual needs are and how they're sort of going to be reflected. For instance, 7 out of the 8 of the participants, talking sort of broadly here, talked about a broadening agenda. Some of them talked about the need to broaden because of insularity. Some people talked about the need to broaden because of things that had actually happened. And some people talked about the need to broaden because they felt some people's perceptions of cultural diversity were sort of very sort of limited. And it was interesting to sort of actually sort of see how context was actually viewed in terms of the position that was actually taken in relation to sort of cultural diversity within the curriculum. I think what it said to me very much was that it's not possible to actually just view context as an absolute. I think sometimes we're very much, as school leaders, encouraged to think, well, how are you making this relevant to context? And we can sometimes think it's the context and nothing but the context. But actually, context has to be looked at in relation to sort of particular beliefs and views and philosophies of learning. If in this case, the position that was actually taken in relation to cultural diversity. So for me, that was something that was sort of quite important, and it kind of fits in with the writings of Thrupp and Lupton, and reminds us of that subjectivity, how people actually interpret things, and so on. But also sort of quite interesting in terms of how sort of context can't just be seen in isolation. It needs to be seen in relation to particular philosophies. Also here as well, an important factor in the orientation of the reasoning is what I've called moderating sort of factors. And those are very much sort of linked to those things that happen at particular times in particular sort of contexts. So those issues that sort of arise that have to be dealt with, but they actually serve to almost moderate the stance that's actually been taken towards cultural diversity. It has to be done in a slightly different way. I was aware as I went through the discussions and the transcripts, there were certain tensions, there were certain contradictions between different parts of the discussions that sort of came out. And I think some of that was very much down to the pragmatics of actually implementing the stance in relation to particular contextual factors that had actually arisen. And some of those were very much pragmatic. It could be to do with staff issues. One particular school, 75% of the teachers were ECTs, and there was felt to be a need to very much focus on developing standards of English and maths teaching. So very important, just in terms of coming out, recognizing that it's not just a singular process. You come up with your stance, you come up with your position, and Bob's your uncle, off you go. You have all of those other things that are actually happening in context, which can impact on how you actually end up doing things. Within that, obviously, there were similarities and differences. Similarities in terms of the way maybe the reasoning was framed. There was a reliance on similar sort of structural contextual components, albeit maybe defined differently in different contexts. But there was also very much the differences that arose from how the reasoning is defined and applied within different contexts. So that leads me to my sort of next little bit, which is to do with the variability, how this process actually impacts on variability. And two particular manifestations in the schools that were participating. In some instances, it was sort of tweaks in the way the provision was provided. It was that made sort of the difference sort of between schools, and that obviously was going to be true in all sorts of ways, even if, in broad terms, that some of the provision was similar, maybe transforming position or whatever in terms of cultural diversity. However, also very important was the nature of the reasoning applied to curricular decisions, because it seemed as though sometimes variability could actually arise from the motivation that underpinned the decisions that were actually taken about cultural diversity. And that was something that Hazebrook sort of itemized. He talked about equifinality, and that sometimes sort of similar outcomes can be caused by very different sort of reasons and causations that sort of lie beneath them as well. But that reasoning, it seems to me, is as much to do with variability, because it's to do with the purpose of the decisions and all the rest of it, as the actual nature of the provision at the end of it. Schools could be doing the same things, but for very different reasons. And also that had an impact in terms of the comparability that sort of actually existed in there as well. Okay. In terms of what does this mean for collaborative professionalism, some thoughts, and these are just some thoughts that have occurred to me in relation to the research that I've actually sort of done. For me, first of all, reasoning in context. It's about going beyond the outcomes. It's about going beyond the level of performance, which makes it such a useful thing to do in terms of informing understanding to support sort of partnerships. It seems that the reasoning can sort of help us prepare for partnership in terms of deciding with others what we need to actually do. It can define the purpose of the partnership or affect the purpose of the partnership. And crucially, I think, most of all for me, understanding the reasoning allows schools in the partnership or other educational establishments to actually sort of come together from a point of understanding each other's position more closely. And I suppose, just to finish, I'll finish with a question, because one of the things that occurred to me when we're thinking about partnerships, about collaborative professionalism, is that partnership going to be formed when we're thinking about the reasoning behind decisions and how that can impact on understanding? Is it going to be formed in relation to what we perceive as something that's similar to what we're already doing? Is it going to be conceived in relation to something that's very obviously different, because that's something maybe we need to do? Or is it going to be a combination of both? And I'll leave that sort of particular thought with you. My final slide, which obviously is there in the recording, it's just a selection of some of the references that I've actually made, but also one or two others that I thought folks might be particularly interested in. Cohen Almagor, for instance, Just Reasonable Multiculturalism is quite an interesting one, thinking a little bit about how sometimes compromise actually happens just by people coming together and coming up with a sort of logical sort of solution. Courtney Gunter and Nish Chulio, interesting in terms of looking at critical perspectives, and also therefore going down Priestley, Anthrop and Lupton, who pretty much lie at the heart of what I'm doing. Thank you very much. Well done for surviving.